So I'll now hand you over to Maajid. Maajid is actually one of the co-founders of Quilliam. It was actually him and another chap called Hussein. It was their real brainchild, the whole thing. So hopefully Maajid will go into a lot more detail about a lot of issues that are alluded to. Thank you.
Thank you all. Assalamu alaikum. It's a pleasure being here to address you today on the issue of my story, my background, and what led me to do the work I'm doing now. And to introduce that topic, I want to begin with probably the worst moment in my life. I don't mean to sound too depressing when saying that, but I think it's important to give you a part of my life where I almost died because of what I believed in, and then trace it backwards to speak about how I arrived there, because that gives the context to what we're doing now. On the 1st of April in 2002, and that's a few months after the 9/11 attacks, armed police from the Egyptian state security raided my flat in Alexandria in Egypt. And they proceeded to arrest me with machine guns and hand grenades. My child was in my arms. He was 1 year at the time. They took him from my arms. They blindfolded me and they took me to their dungeons in Cairo. And they took me underground. They tied my hands behind my back with rags. And there were hundreds of us in these dungeons in a building called Al-Jihaz. Any of you who understands Arabic, Al-Jihaz means the apparatus. And the name was appropriately given. This was the torture facility of the Egyptian state security. And from day one, they began electrocuting everyone in these dungeons by applying electricity to the teeth and to the private parts of these young men who were taken in the dungeons of the Egyptian state security. They gave us numbers. The numbers began from number 1 and it went all the way into the hundreds. My number was 42. And they began the torture with a roll call. So they would call out a name. They would call out a number, number 1. Number 1 is taken from his position. He's taken into the torture cell and he's electrocuted. And the rest of the hundreds had to listen to the screams as number 1 is given the torture. Then they called number 2, and number 2 was taken into the torture room. And then they called number 3, and they called number 4, and they called number 5. And one by one, you had to listen to the torture of the person before you. So if you're number 50, you would have to listen to 49 people scream their lungs out as electricity is applied to their teeth and their genitalia to force them to confess. So next to me was number 41. He was blindfolded, I was blindfolded. Till this day I don't know what he looks like. But the poor chap was, when number 40 was called, his turn was next. He had heard 39 people before him tortured. And number 41 was breaking down. He was psychologically in a state of severe distress. He'd been there for 3 days listening to these tortures. He was not able to sleep because they would beat anyone who fell asleep. We had to answer our number call every hour. So the only thing I could say to 41, he turned to me and he said, "I need your help." I've never seen him since that day, but I will never forget this. He said, "I need your help." I said, "Brother, how can I help you?" He said, "How can I have strength to go through this situation? I don't know what to do." I said, "You're a man of faith. You're here because you're a believer." He said, "Yes." I said, "Well, read to yourself Surah Buruj, the story of the boy who was tortured by the king, and the entire village was thrown into the ditch. As anyone who knows the story of Surah Buruj will know." I said, "Read to yourself the Surah of Buruj." He said, "I can't read because I don't have the strength to speak." So I began reciting Surah Buruj for him as he was sitting next to me to calm his nerves. And then this man was taken and he was tortured. After 4 days, we were removed from these dungeons and we were put into solitary confinement, where we were held for 4 months, just under 4 months. We were given 15 minutes of daylight and 23 hours and 45 minutes in the cells. And eventually we were sentenced to 5 years in prison in Egypt. I served my sentence in a prison known as Mazra'a Tura in Cairo. Mazra'a Tura is the prison where Sayyid Qutb, who is any of you who know the history of jihadism, Sayyid Qutb is the author of the book Milestones. Milestones laid the intellectual foundations for Al-Qaeda today. It was a prison, Mazra'a Tura, ironically was built by the British to house political prisoners who were rebelling against the British Empire. And now it was housing me and other prisoners. From that prison, Sayyid Qutb smuggled out milestones. And I was in prison with the man who was a young man in those days, in the 60s, who smuggled out the book Milestones on behalf of Sayyid Qutb into the wider world. And for that book, Milestones, Sayyid Qutb was executed by the Egyptian regime for writing a book. I was also in prison with the assassins of the former president of Egypt, who was killed in 1981 by the Egyptian Islamic Jihad or Tanzim al-Jihad in Egypt. Many of them were executed in that case, but 2 of them were given life sentences, and they were with me in prison. The man who smuggled out milestones for Sayyid Qutb is now the global emir or leader for the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. His name is Dr. Muhammad al-Badir. He's now the Murshid al-Am for the Global Muslim Brotherhood. He was my cellmate, as were the founders of the Al-Jama'a al-Islamiyya, which is Egypt's largest jihadist organization. So, as well as my own members of my own group, I was in prison with the who's who of the jihadist founders and leaders of these organizations, which all began in Egypt. Now the question is, I was only 24 years old when this happened to me. How did a man, at the time I suppose a boy really in many senses, no offense to anyone who's 24 in the audience, but how did a man born and raised in the UK, in Essex, arrive to find himself going through torture and being locked down in prison with the assassins of a president, with members of Ayman Zawahiri's Egyptian Jihad, and with a whole array, with the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood in a prison in Egypt, originally set up to hold political insurgents. I'm a graduate of law and Arabic. It's a very hard degree, by the way. I studied a master's in political theory in the London School of Economics. I had no shortage of career options. I speak 3 languages, Urdu, Arabic and English. I think I'm reasonably well presented. How did a man in my situation end up in that prison where he had to go through all of what I've just described? And that's the crux of the matter. Because what we're dealing with here in Columbus, Ohio, is exactly the same scenario. Your children, or your brothers, or your sisters, your sons and your daughters have been born here in America. Some of them are embarking upon a journey that will lead them to the place that I was in the year 2002. Some of them have already embarked upon that journey. Some of them have been killed in the process. Many of them, when they have been killed, think that they are martyrs, shuhada. We saw people drop dead in prison in front of our eyes because of the wounds from their torture. People drop dead from disease that could have been cured because of the conditions in prison. Every time one of the inmates died, there was almost a riot in the prison. All of these lives lost by people who considered that they are martyrs. So how do we get to that scenario? And how do your own sons and brothers and daughters get to that same situation where only 3 days ago an American-born Somali Muslim was killed fighting with Shabab in Somalia? How do we arrive at that when you're in the land of opportunity? When between us we know, when we sit together